the Mothman's become this, universe that we can project ourselves onto. And that I feel a lot of power in, and that I sort of felt empowered to kind of do in the book and kind of reimagine the Mothman as, a teenager trying to make sense of the world, which I at one point deeply felt like. So the Mothman is this creature in West Virginia sort of folklore who appeared in the late 60s as this sort of 5 to 6 foot tall, dark winged creature that would visit people, mostly teenagers, like hanging out, late in the evening. And they would and had these intense glowing red eyes, and they would feel this sense of impending dread. And it kept happening over the course of several months to several years. And there's been random sightings since then, but most of this was around Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where there then was a subsequent bridge collapse. That, the supposition is that the Mothman was a harbinger of this disaster, and the Mothman has since been tied to a series of other disasters around West Virginia, just in sort of the folklore. And in my book, I've sort of stepped away from the Mothman as this clear creature, and instead the Mothman is, a teenager who's sort of discovering their own existence as a harbinger of, a series of disasters, and is wondering why they're not more present, or why all these, tragedies happen around them, and no one seems to be stopping them or warning them. And so the Mothman's sort of aware of its own disappearance. So this is my book, Mothman Apologia. It is a book that's intensely about place. It's about growing up in Virginia, and visiting family in West Virginia, and the spaces there, and the kinds of grief and the kinds of struggle that are endemic to those places, and also, most importantly, the kinds of joy and the kinds of community that pop up in those places. It's structured in 3 parts narratively. A growing up, a experiencing, and then a looking back on those experiencing, and then it's sort of like woven, and then 3 other elements are sort of woven in, where a third of the poems in the book are elegies for the loss of friends to the opioid epidemic. A third of the poems in the book are persona poems from the perspective of the Mothman, who's reimagined as a teenager growing up in these spaces, and sort of examining what it means to be in those spaces. And then a third of the poems are what I think of as sort of loose individual poems that kind of reinforce the same themes, and sort of like fill in and speak back to those two other sets of poems from different voices. So writing about place for me is always tricky, because you have to sort of create an invented audience, and your invented audience for me, it was always going to be combined of both people who recognize the place and would be the first people to raise their hands and be like, that's not the way, like that road doesn't connect to this other road, or like that's not the way it works at all, man. With people who've never been to the place and need to understand it emotionally, even if they don't understand it physically. If your audience is exclusively the outsider, and this is really tempting with writing about rural areas, and particularly with writing about Appalachia, is so much of the audience is often outsiders who are gawking at a space and want it to be, and want to only focus on the elements that are so different from their life and so different from their emotional interiority, and to sort of be shocked and come away. And Scott McClanahan writes about that in his book Crapalachia, where he doesn't want to write books that kind of like are for people from outside of the space to kind of gawk in a horrified manner. And I try to keep that in mind. These are poems that are that I would want to read. That I wanted to write poems that I would want to read as an 18-year-old who'd only knew growing up in the woods. But I also want them to sort of matter to people who have maybe a larger literary experience than I certainly had when I was 18. I'd always written traditionally punctuated poems until about, the fall of 2019. And I'd been skeptical when I encountered aggressively unpunctuated poems. And then I stumbled upon Ellen Bryant Voigt's book, Headwaters, which is all unpunctuated, unbelievable. And the first poem which is the title poem of the book, ends with, I try to do better in this regard. Don't you think I'm doing better? And the fact that there's no breath between any of the sentences was just an incredible energy for me. And so I just started writing, trying to write the way that she wrote. And for the next, I lost 6 months. The next 6 months, my poems were terrible. And I was sending them out places, and I don't think a single one from that sort of era of my work has been picked up anywhere. And I've sort of given up on the idea that they ever would be. But it forced me to, when I was writing without punctuation, it forced me to think about how do you prevent yourself from tripping up the reader every time, or even tripping yourself up when you're reading it aloud. And so I had to restructure my sentences so they worked without punctuation, which was really exciting and really freeing. And then I'd also encountered other poets who just sort of worked with, internal caesuras. And Danez Smith has done that. I think Hanif Abdurraqib has done that. And so that the sense of sort of structuring something so it has line breaks inside of a prose poem, and how I could sort of create a different kind of break was really exciting. And so the intense failure of trying to write like Ellen Bryant Voigt and just being I cannot do this, and trying to have to build something else out, ended up allowing me to kind of create these, I just sat down and was okay, how do I build in the kind of codes to the reader that I need? And it was a lot of just figuring out how Microsoft Word would allow me to justify poems correctly. The idea of trying to find and identify that something is working is one of the hardest things to notice. I genuinely, when I was writing, the set of unpunctuated funny poems that were coming out of Ellen Bryant Voigt, I deeply thought they were working for a really long time, and it took only coming back to them 3-4 months later. Time is sort of the only way to realize what's working and what's not, and that's also that's also what's so important of having a poetry community, because your community will, number one, force you to write in different ways. Whether that's by kind of literally being hey, today we're all going to write a James Tate ripoff or whatever, or a poem in the style of someone else, which is a really exciting exercise for people to impose upon each other. Or you see your peers writing and you say, why doesn't my work do that? And so you start borrowing, even when you don't think you're borrowing from it, you start borrowing from it. And then your peers will take a look at your work with completely fresh eyes, a week after you wrote it, and be able to tell you what's exciting to them about it. And a poetry workshop should never be a focus group. If your peers don't like something, it doesn't mean that it's not working. But it's a nice way to get the feedback that you can only give yourself once you give it 2-3 months before pulling the poem out of the drawer and looking at it again. So ultimately, this is, for me, is a reminder as I've amped up my poem production. And knowing that 90% of the poems that I will write will never see the light of day, but the more that I write, the better the poems that I want to show people will be. So it's just an incentive to just keep writing and keep trying new things, and you'll only find out in retrospect whether it worked or not. That's an excellent question, because I feel I have been on all sides of the world of writing poems alone in my office or in my apartment for 6 or 7 years, out of undergrad, to having come from learning to write poetry seriously inside of a workshop to kind of being fully, I can no longer imagine myself, for so long I imagined myself as an outsider of the world of poetry, and I no longer can imagine myself that way. It's both freeing and kind of scary, but there is an enormous amount of community out there, and there's an enormous amount of writers who are hungry for a community. The easiest way to do it is to find yourself into workshops. And there are lots of online workshops all over, all over the internet. There's Catapult, there's 92Y, there's Grub Street. There's so many places where you can sort of put yourself in a group of peers. Many of them cost money though, so it's possible to find it for free just by hanging out in the spaces where people who like the kind of writing that you like hang out. And whether those are digital spaces or whether those are like going to every poetry reading by someone that you care about, and then doing the awkward work of hanging out afterwards. And it snowballs, right? It's hard to hang out after a reading when you know 1 or 2 people at the reading, and it's really hard if you know 0 people at the reading. But if you know 3 people, then you find you are the group of people that people are coming up to talk to, and that's how you meet new people. And then once you start sharing poems, the act of just sharing poems with people and realizing, okay, this is this person, there's something intriguing in their work that I just want to sort of like hang on to and not let go of. And that's how I've sort of built community. I think it works probably a little bit differently for everybody, but it's out there and it's worth doing the work for. The wildest thing, I had submitted to the prize, but never ever considered it as a possibility, that it was one of those like aspirational, well, you better do this because you never know. But for me, it was like winning the lottery. I did not believe it. Ray Armentrout called me to tell me that I'd been selected for the Yale Younger Poets series. And I took a minute because I didn't believe that it was happening. And it took a minute for me to process what it meant. It's also, for me, to be on a list of poets that includes John Ashbery and Adrienne Rich and Bridget McGean Kelly and Richard Seikin is like just overwhelming. So it was one of those moments where you're like, okay, this is incredible. It was also really hard in a way that, maybe it's a tiny violin problem, but it also sent me into sort of like a really sad place where, if I could, like, the book is about the loss of people that I really dearly cared for. And if I could undo the prize and not have them back in the world again, I would do it in a heartbeat. So there was a good month, right, in the little interim between finding out that I'd won and there's a month before it's announced. And in that time, I was just there's a lot of intents missing, and a lot of intents just like sort of wishing that the world had been structured differently and the book would never have been written. But it's amazing. It's an amazing. Yale University Press has been so great to me. I did not know that I would mean that I would get to spend a month living in, the James Merrill House, and that has also been incredible. And it's also I've been able to interact with the poets that I've taken seriously for my entire, poetic life, and to be treated as a peer is wild. Let me read a couple poems. So this is Voicemail from My Mother, and this poem is for Claudia Emerson, who was my first poetry professor in college. I haven't heard from you in a while. Did I tell you a bird flew into the house? Found an open door on a cold day. Something small, like a chickadee, but even more chickadee than that. I chased it around the house with an upturned broom until I lost track through all that sweeping of dirty air. This was a ways back, 2 cats ago. I didn't see it fly out, so it's hung in my mind ever since, an unclosed parenthesis. I've braced myself, the way the ear hears a squeal of brakes and begs for a thud. Braced myself to find a tiny skeleton each time I clean behind the curtains or rearrange the furniture. Today, opening the drawer of cords that go to things I probably already threw away, it flew out, perched briefly on my shoulder, then alighted hard, and I mean hard, into the mirror of the closed window.
Beautiful.
And this is the summer after the winter I taught you how to start a fire. You asked me what I knew about thermals, heat's tendency to rise, cool, fall again, And so I showed you how to recognize the circle of turkey vultures over our neighbor's field as a clue another calf had died. Immediately, you declared yourself the detective of all dead things. Something's dead, you'd say, squinting skyward. Case closed. That'll be $50. It was one of your better jokes, and as with all jokes, funny at first, then a little less, until repeated only as an epitaph for how funny it once was. 50 American dollars. This debt smoldering like your anger after I told you the words, I love you, worked the same way. I was careful to say so in the joking tone reserved for the parts of this living too disappointing to speak plain. Something's dead, you'd say, a skill precisely too late to be of any use. Same as me here, explaining the joke. The check I'd mail if I had your new address. Since being here at the Merrill House, I had a friend who just writes a poem a day, and we've just been exchanging a poem a day. And I don't know how long I can keep that up, but I've never written at that pace. And it has been delightful. And I think I've written more poems, since being at the Merrill House than I wrote in all of 2021. And the output is a much higher quality than I would have expected, because ultimately the act of writing is where most of the ideas come from.